The morning Vivian Hale found out I raised my daughter alone with one arm, she didn't say a word. She just picked up the diaper bag I dropped in the break room, slid the strap over my shoulder without asking, and never once looked at me like I was broken. What I didn't know yet was that the woman helping me snap a onesie closed with steady, careful fingers owned the building we were standing in. Owned the company. Owned more than I could have counted in 3 lifetimes. And she never told anyone. My name is Daniel Cross. I'm 36, and for the last 4 years I've worked the receiving dock and then the inventory floor at Halden Freight and Logistics, a mid-sized shipping company on the edge of town that moved boxes nobody thought about until they didn't arrive on time. Before that, I was a different man. I had 2 arms. I had a wife named Sarah. I had a life that felt ordinary in a good way, the way you don't appreciate until a truck runs a red light on a Tuesday in March and takes half of it away in about 4 seconds. I don't talk about the accident much. Not because it's some deep secret, but because people's faces do this thing when you tell them. They go soft and careful, like you might shatter if they use the wrong words. Sarah died at the scene. I woke up 9 days later missing my left arm below the elbow and a wife I never got to say a real goodbye to. My daughter, Lily, was 11 months old at the time. She doesn't remember her mother's voice. She only knows the version of her I've built out of photographs and stories I try to tell without my own voice cracking. So that's the short version. Single father, 1 arm, a daughter who thinks a prosthetic hook is just a normal part of what dads have, and a job that paid enough to keep the lights on if I was careful and nothing went wrong. Nothing ever stays that simple for long, though. Not in my life, and not in this story. Vivian showed up at Halden about 8 months ago. Transferred in from what HR called corporate, which around our warehouse was less a place and more a rumor. Nobody from corporate ever came down to the floor. Corporate was where memos got written telling us why our raises were delayed. So when a woman in plain gray slacks and a company polo showed up asking where the intake terminals were, half the guys assumed she was lost. She wasn't lost. She was exactly where she meant to be, though none of us understood that yet. First real conversation we had, she was standing at the terminal next to mine, struggling with the scanner gun because nobody had shown her which button actually fired the laser. I reached over with my right hand, my only hand, and pressed it for her without thinking twice. "There," I said. "Trigger's stiff. Everybody fights it the first week." She looked at the scanner, then at me, then at the way I'd braced the device against my forearm to hold it steady. Most people's eyes catch on the prosthetic for half a second before they catch themselves. Hers didn't. She just said, "Thank you," like I'd handed her a pen. "Vivian," she said, holding out her hand. "Daniel. Everybody calls me Dan." "I'll call you Daniel," she said. "Until you earn the shorter version." That should have annoyed me. Somehow it didn't. It just made me want to know what earning it looked like. For the first few weeks, Vivian kept to herself in the quiet way people do when they're new somewhere and still learning who's worth trusting. She ate lunch alone at first, reading actual paperback books instead of scrolling a phone like everyone else. She asked good questions on the floor, the kind that told you she was paying attention instead of just filling time. She never complained about the cold in the warehouse in January or the heat in July, never acted like the work was beneath her, which struck me as strange for someone who talked the way she did. Careful. Precise. Like every sentence had already been proofread before it left her mouth. I noticed things about her I probably shouldn't have. The watch she wore was simple, no logo, but it moved like something that cost more than my truck. Her shoes were plain, but they fit like they'd been made for her feet specifically, not pulled off a shelf. She drove an old sedan to work, nothing flashy, but once I saw her get out of a black car 3 blocks from the warehouse and walk the rest of the way, like she didn't want anyone watching her arrive. I told myself none of that was my business. A man raising a daughter alone on one income doesn't have time to play detective about a coworker's driving habits. I had a kid who needed her hair done before school, a truck payment, and a rotator cuff that ached every night from compensating for the arm I didn't have anymore. Vivian Hale's secrets, whatever they were, could stay hers. Then Lily got sick. It was a Thursday, the kind of ordinary Thursday that turns into the day your whole life reorganizes itself around one phone call. I was mid-shift, stacking a pallet with my hook steady against a box while my right hand guided the strap, when my phone buzzed with the school's number. My stomach dropped before I even answered, the way it always does now. You learn that reflex when you've already lost one person to a phone call you weren't ready for. Mr. Cross, this is the front office at Jefferson Elementary. Lily's running a fever, 102.3. We need someone to come pick her up. I told them I'd be there in 20 minutes. Then I hung up and stood there in the middle of the warehouse floor with a pallet half-wrapped and a supervisor named Russ who'd made it clear more than once that Halden wasn't in the business of accommodating personal situations on the clock. Russ was already walking over before I finished dialing my sister, who I knew wasn't going to answer because she worked mornings at a dental office 2 counties over and never had her phone on her. Cross, we've got 3 trucks backed up, Russ said. You can't just walk off. My daughter's sick. The school's calling. Everybody's got something, he said, which was Russ's answer to everything, the kind of sentence that told you exactly how much your life mattered to him, which was not at all. I was standing there doing the math I do too often. Lose the hours, or lose the job. Leave my sick daughter sitting in a nurse's office for 2 hours until my shift ended, or leave this warehouse short-staffed and probably get written up for it. There was no good version of that math. There never is when you're the only parent left. That's when Vivian appeared at my elbow, clipboard in hand, voice calm and even louder than it needed to be. I'll cover his section, she said to Russ. I've cross-trained on the scanners. He needs to go. Russ looked at her like she'd spoken out of turn, which in his world, she had. This isn't your call, Hale. It is, actually, she said, and something in the way she said it made Russ's mouth close halfway through whatever he was about to say next. I'll clear it with Denise upstairs if you need me to. Russ didn't argue further. I've thought about that moment 100 times since, the way a floor supervisor who bossed around grown men twice his size backed down from a woman he'd known for 2 months. At the time, I chalked it up to Vivian being persuasive. I didn't yet understand that Denise upstairs answered to people who answered to Vivian, not the other way around. Go, Vivian told me. I've got this. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. Go get your daughter, Daniel. I went. And for the rest of that day, sitting in a pediatrician's waiting room with Lily's hot little hand in mine, I kept thinking about the way Vivian hadn't hesitated. Not for a second. Like helping me wasn't a favor she was doing, just the obvious thing a person does. The next morning, I found a bag of soup, crackers, and children's fever medicine sitting on my workstation with a sticky note that just said, "Hope she feels better." No fanfare. No mention of it in front of anyone else. I asked around quietly, trying to figure out how she'd known what to buy, what brand, what dosage for a 6-year-old. Nobody had told her Lily's age. I never found out how she knew, though later, once I understood who she really was, I stopped being surprised by how much Vivian Hale knew about things she was never supposed to know about. That was the beginning of something, though neither of us named it yet. We started eating lunch at the same table, not because we planned it, just because it kept happening. She asked about Lily constantly, not in the performative way people ask about kids to be polite, but like she actually wanted the details. What Lily was reading. Whether she liked the dinosaur unit at school better than the ocean one. Whether she still refused to eat anything green. "She'll eat green if I hide it in something orange," I told her once. Mac and cheese with pureed carrots and spinach. She's never caught on. Vivian laughed, a real laugh, not the careful controlled sound she usually made. That's either brilliant parenting or a felony. Little of both. She was easy to talk to in a way I hadn't expected from someone who seemed to guard every other part of herself so carefully. I told her things I hadn't told anyone at Halden. About Sarah. About the 6 months after the accident where I could barely hold a fork, let alone a 6-month-old baby, and how my mother-in-law had moved in for a year just to keep both of us alive. About learning to braid hair with one hand and a lot of patience, about the specific hell of trying to open a stubborn jar of pickles in front of your kid without asking for help because some stupid part of you needs her to believe you can still do everything. Vivian never once treated any of it like a tragedy she had to manage. She just listened, and asked good questions, and occasionally said something that cut right through whatever I was dancing around. "You act like needing help is a failure," she told me one afternoon in the break room. "It isn't. It's just math. One person, half as many hands. You're not less capable. You're just working a harder equation than most people ever have to." I didn't have a response to that. I just sat there with my coffee going cold, feeling like someone had finally said out loud the thing I'd needed to hear for 4 years. Around month 5, Lily met her. It wasn't planned. The warehouse had a family day, a cookout in the parking lot that Halden threw once a year mostly so corporate could take photos for the company newsletter. I brought Lily because my sister was working and I didn't have anyone else to watch her. Vivian showed up in jeans and a t-shirt, looking younger and less careful than she did in her work polo, and within 10 minutes, Lily had adopted her completely. "Are you Daddy's friend?" Lily asked her, point blank, the way 6-year-olds ask everything. "I think I am," Vivian said, crouching down to Lily's height without being asked. "Is that all right with you?" Lily considered this with the seriousness only a 6-year-old can manage. "You have to like dinosaurs." "I love dinosaurs," Vivian said. "Ankylosaurus is underrated. Everyone talks about the T-Rex, but the tail club could break bone." Lily's whole face lit up like Vivian had just passed the most important test of her short life. For the rest of the afternoon, my daughter dragged Vivian around the parking lot showing her rocks she'd decided were fossils, and I stood by the grill watching the two of them with an ache in my chest I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Not sadness exactly. Something more like hope, and hope scared me more than grief ever had, because hope means you have something left to lose. That night, after I put Lily to bed, I sat on my back steps and let myself admit what I'd been avoiding for weeks. I was falling for Vivian Hale, warehouse worker, careful talker, woman with a watch that cost more than sense and a car she parked 3 blocks away like she didn't want to be seen in it. I still didn't know why. Not everyone on the floor was happy watching Vivian and me grow closer, and I should have paid more attention to that before it caused trouble. A woman named Sherry who worked the packing line had made it plain from the start that she thought Vivian was too polished for our warehouse, too careful with her words, too clean under her fingernails for someone who claimed to be an ordinary transfer from corporate. Sherry never said anything cruel to my face, but she said plenty behind my back, and eventually enough of it reached me the way things always do in a place where 60 people share 2 break rooms and 1 set of rumors. She's just slumming it before she goes back to whatever she really does, I overheard Sherry telling another woman near the lockers one afternoon, not bothering to lower her voice much. Girl like that doesn't end up sniffing around a guy with 1 arm and somebody else's kid unless she's got an angle. I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that defending yourself to people who've already decided what you are rarely changes their mind, it just gives them a better story to tell later. But it sat with me anyway, that phrase, somebody else's kid, like Lily was a complication instead of the best thing that had ever happened to me. I carried that little splinter of a comment around for days without telling Vivian, mostly because I didn't want her to think I needed defending, and partly because some old, stubborn part of me still believed I should be able to absorb every hit on my own. Vivian figured it out anyway. She always did. "You've been quiet," she said one evening, walking me to my truck after a shift. "Quieter than usual, and you've got a specific kind of quiet you do when something's bothering you that you've decided not to mention." "It's nothing, Daniel," I told her, eventually, mostly because I'd never been good at lying to her even before I found out how good she'd been at lying to me. She listened without interrupting, jaw tightening slightly at the phrase somebody else's kid, and then she did something I didn't expect. She walked straight back into the building, found Sherry restocking a shelf near the packing line, and had a quiet conversation with her that I wasn't part of and never asked about. Sherry didn't say another word about either of us after that, not because Vivian had thrown her weight around. She told me later she hadn't mentioned Hale Industries at all, just reminded Sherry plainly that gossip about a man's daughter wasn't the same thing as gossip about his coworker, and one of those things she wasn't willing to let slide. "You didn't have to do that," I told her. "I know," she said. "I wanted to. There's a difference." That became something I noticed about Vivian more and more as the months went on, the difference between what she felt obligated to do and what she actually chose, freely, without anyone forcing her hand. It showed up in small things. The way she came to Lily's school Halloween parade even though it meant using a vacation day she'd never once used for herself in 8 months of working there. The way she learned, without being asked, exactly how to help me thread a shoelace one-handed instead of just doing it for me, because she'd noticed early on that I hated being handled more than I hated being slow. The truth came apart the way most big truths do, sideways, and from a direction I never saw coming. It was a Tuesday in late October. Halden had been buzzing for weeks about a possible sale, corporate rumors about the parent company restructuring, half the floor convinced layoffs were coming before the holidays. Russ had gotten meaner about it, the way small men get meaner when they're scared, riding us harder on quotas like productivity numbers could save jobs that decisions far above his head were about to erase. I was on my lunch break, sitting in my truck because the break room felt too crowded with rumors that day, when I made the mistake of scrolling through a business news app my brother-in-law had put on my phone months ago and I'd never bothered to delete. A headline caught my eye before I understood why it should have. Hale Industries heiress steps back from board, cites need for real-world perspective. There was a photo. A gala, some charity event from 2 years back, women in gowns that cost more than my annual salary. And there, third from the left, unmistakable even in makeup and jewelry I'd never seen on her, was Vivian. Vivian Hale. Not a coincidence of last names. Not a distant relative. The actual heiress to Hale Industries, the multinational holding company that, as I scrolled further with my thumb shaking slightly against the screen, I learned owned approximately 40% of Halden Freight and Logistics through a subsidiary chain 3 layers deep. My employer. Her family's company. And she was standing on my warehouse floor scanning packages next to a man who couldn't afford new brakes for his truck, letting me tell her about pureed carrots and macaroni and cheese like she needed the advice. I sat in that truck for the rest of my lunch break, not eating, just staring at that photograph until the screen dimmed and locked itself. I didn't confront her right away. I told myself I needed to think, but really, I think I was scared of what I'd say if I opened my mouth too soon. That afternoon, I moved through my shift like I was underwater, barely hearing Russ bark about quotas, barely tasting the coffee I drank on autopilot. When Vivian came by my station around 2, smiling in that careful, real way she'd started smiling around me, I couldn't return it. "You okay?" she asked. "Fine," I said, which was the first lie I'd ever told her. She studied me for a second longer than a normal person would have. Vivian always noticed things. I think some part of her already suspected I knew, even then. I waited until after our shift, in the parking lot, when most of the floor had cleared out and it was just her sedan and my truck sitting under the sodium lights. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course. Is your last name really Hale? As in Hale Industries?" Her face didn't do the thing I expected. She didn't look caught, exactly. She looked like someone who'd been waiting a long time for a particular door to open and wasn't sure if she was relieved or terrified now that it finally had. "Yes," she said quietly. "You own part of this company." "My family does. I have shares. I don't run anything here. I never wanted to." "But you knew," I said, my voice coming out harder than I meant it to. "This whole time. You knew you owned the place you were pretending to punch a clock at. You knew when Russ backed down that day I had to leave for Lily, it wasn't because you were persuasive. It was because you could have fired him with one phone call." "I never used that," she said. "Not once. I told you, I don't run anything here." "That's not the point, Vivian." Her real name felt strange in my mouth now, like I was meeting a stranger wearing a familiar face. "The point is you let me sit there talking about how hard it is to make rent some months. You let me tell you about the year I ate ramen 4 nights a week so Lily could have new shoes for school. You let me think we were the same kind of tired. We are the same kind of tired, she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, her voice cracked slightly. Just not for the same reasons. That's not the same thing at all. I know that. She took a step toward me, then stopped herself, like she'd caught herself doing something she didn't have permission for anymore. Daniel, I didn't come here to lie to you. I came here because I was drowning in a different way than you are, and I didn't know how to explain that to anyone who'd only ever see the money. Try me, I said. Explain it. She looked out at the parking lot for a long moment before she spoke again. My whole life, everyone around me has wanted something from me before they even bother finding out who I am. Business partners want access. Men I dated wanted a lifestyle. My own family mostly wants me to sit quietly on a board and vote the way I'm told. I have never, not once in 31 years, had a single person treat me like a person first. I took this job under a different last name because I wanted 3 months of being invisible. Just 3 months of being normal before I went back to the version of my life where every room goes quiet when I walk in. And then, I said. And then it turned into 8 months because I met you, she said. And your daughter. And I stopped wanting to be anywhere else. I stood there with my keys in my hand, feeling the anger drain out of me slower than I wanted it to, replaced by something more complicated. You should have told me. I know. Every day you didn't, it got harder too. I know that too. She finally let herself close the distance between us. I'm not going to pretend I have a good excuse, Daniel. I don't. I just have the truth, which is that I was a coward about the one thing in my life that actually mattered, because I was terrified that the second you knew, you'd look at me the way everyone else does. Like a number. Like an opportunity. And I couldn't survive you looking at me that way. Not after knowing what it felt like when you didn't. I wanted to stay angry. Anger was simpler. Anger didn't ask me to trust someone again after I'd just found out the ground I'd been standing on wasn't what I thought it was. I need some time, I said. She nodded, and I saw something in her face brace for the possibility that time was just a polite word for never. Okay, she said. Take whatever you need. I didn't call her for 11 days. 11 days of going through the motions at work, avoiding her section of the floor, feeling Lily ask me twice why Miss Vivian hadn't come by for dinner, and not having a good answer for a 6-year-old that wouldn't also break something in her that had just started to heal. On the 12th day, everything at Halden changed at once, and it changed because of exactly the kind of thing I'd been afraid was lurking under Vivian's silence the whole time. Corporate announced the restructuring wasn't a rumor anymore. Hale Industries Board, led by Vivian's cousin, a man named Preston Hale who I'd never met and never wanted to, had voted to approve a sale of the logistics division to a private equity firm that specialized, according to the memo posted in the break room, in operational efficiency, which everyone on the floor understood to mean layoffs. 40% of Halden's workforce, gone within 90 days. My name was on a preliminary list a friend in HR let slip to me off the record, because I was hourly, because I'd used more sick days than most for Lily's appointments, because on paper, without any of the context that made me a decent employee and a good father, I looked exactly like the kind of line item a spreadsheet erases without blinking. I found out on a Wednesday morning and spent the whole shift feeling like the floor of my life had opened up again, the same lurch I'd felt the day the hospital called about Sarah. I had 11 days of savings if I stretched it. I had a daughter who needed shoes in a size bigger than she currently wore, because kids grow whether or not your paycheck does. Vivian found me in the parking lot that evening, sitting in my truck with the engine off, staring at nothing. "I heard," she said through the rolled-down window, "about the list." "Guess your cousin's efficient," I said, and I heard how bitter it came out, and I didn't take it back. "He's not my cousin in any way that matters to me," she said. "I haven't spoken to Preston in 3 years. Doesn't change what he's about to do to 60 families." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But it might change what I do about it." I looked at her then, really looked, for the first time since the parking lot conversation that had put 11 days of silence between us. "What does that mean?" "It means I've spent 8 months hiding from my own name because I was tired of it defining every relationship I had. But I still have it. And it still means something, whether I like using it or not." Her jaw was set in a way I hadn't seen before, steady, certain. "I'm not going to let Preston get this warehouse to make a quarterly number look prettier. Not while you're on that list. Not while anyone who's actually shown up every single day for this place is on that list." "You said you don't run anything here." "I don't run this warehouse," she said. "But I hold enough shares in the parent company to force an emergency board vote, and I know exactly which relationships on that board Preston has spent years quietly damaging. I've been too tired and too guilty to use any of that for myself. I am not too tired to use it for this." I didn't know what to say to that. Some small, stubborn part of me still wanted to hold on to the anger, because the anger was familiar and safe, and letting it go meant admitting how much I still wanted her in my life, complications and all. "Vivian," I said slowly, "I don't need you to save my job." "I know you don't need it," she said. "You've never needed saving, Daniel. You've been doing this alone for 4 years and you'd keep doing it alone if you had to. That's not why I'm doing this." She stepped closer to the truck window. "I'm doing this because it's right, and because for the first time in my life I have a reason to actually use what I was born into instead of running from it. That reason is you. And Lily. And every person on that floor who deserves better than being a rounding error to my cousin." I sat there for a long moment, hands on the wheel, letting that land. "I'm still not over the lying," I said finally. "I know. I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking you to let me prove that the last 8 months were real, even with the part one didn't tell you." The board meeting happened 9 days later, in a glass building downtown I'd never had a reason to enter, wearing a suit I'd borrowed from my brother-in-law because I didn't own one that fit right anymore after the accident changed my body's whole shape. Vivian had asked me to come, not to speak, just to be there, and I said yes because some part of me needed to see this version of her, the one she'd spent 8 months hiding from, standing in the room she was born into and refusing to shrink. Preston Hale looked exactly like I'd pictured him. Expensive suit, easy smile, the kind of confidence that comes from never once in his life being told no in a way that stuck. He looked at Vivian like she was an inconvenience that had wandered back into a room she'd voluntarily left. "Vivian," he said, standing to greet her with a hug she didn't return. "I heard you were slumming it at one of the subsidiaries." Very on brand for your rebellious phase. I wasn't slumming, Preston, she said, taking her seat at the long table. I was working. There's a difference, though I understand why you've never needed to learn it. A few board members exchanged glances. I stood near the back of the room, feeling every eye that flicked toward me and away, wondering what story they were already building about who I was and why I'd been allowed in. The meeting itself moved faster than I expected, full of language I only half understood, terms like divestiture and operational synergy that all seemed to be expensive words for the same simple, ugly thing, taking something away from people who needed it to survive. Preston laid out the sale terms with the ease of a man who'd rehearsed the pitch a dozen times, numbers projected on a screen behind him, promising efficiency, promising shareholder value, never once saying the words layoffs or families or 60 people who wouldn't be able to make rent by spring. When he finished, Vivian stood. "I'd like to propose an amendment," she said, "before this vote proceeds." Preston's easy smile flickered. "Vivian, you've been absent from this board for 2 years. This isn't the moment to reappear with opinions." "I'm not reappearing with opinions," she said. "I'm reappearing with shares. 12% of the parent company, which, combined with the Ashford family's holdings, which I spoke with Margaret about this morning, gives me enough leverage to table this vote pending an independent review of the workforce impact." She let that settle before continuing. "You've built this proposal around a number on a slide, Preston. I've spent 8 months on the floor of that warehouse. I know the names behind the number you're about to erase. I know the man who works receiving with one arm and raises his daughter alone, who's never missed a shift he could physically make, who trained 3 new hires last spring on his own time because nobody else would. I know the woman who's worked nights for 11 years to put her son through community college. I know what 60 families losing income 2 months before the holidays actually looks like, because I've eaten lunch across from them for 8 months, something none of you have ever bothered to do." The room had gone very quiet. Preston's face had lost its easy smile entirely. "This is theater," he said. "You want to play working class for a season and now you think you understand a balance sheet better than people who've run this company for 20 years. I understand that a balance sheet with 60 fewer names on it doesn't actually make this company more efficient," Vivian said. "It makes it smaller, and meaner, and worse. I'm not asking you to keep every position forever out of charity. I'm asking for 90 days and an independent review that actually accounts for institutional knowledge and tenure, instead of a spreadsheet built by a consultant who's never set foot on that floor." The vote to table Preston's original proposal passed 8-5. It wasn't a full victory, not that day. Nothing in that world moves as cleanly as I wanted it to. But it was 90 days, and an independent review, and my name coming off a list that had felt, 11 days earlier, like the ground disappearing under my feet all over again. Preston caught up with Vivian in the hallway afterward, and for a second I thought I should give them privacy, but Vivian looked back at me and something in her expression asked me to stay, so I did. "You've made an enemy today," Preston told her, voice low and tight. "I've had you as an enemy since we were 14 and you told our grandfather I'd never be serious enough to run anything," she said. "I'm not worried about making it official." "And him?" Preston nodded toward me, not bothering to lower his voice, like I wasn't standing close enough to hear every word. "This is what you left the family for. A warehouse worker with half an arm and someone else's kid to raise. I felt my jaw tighten, felt the old reflex to make myself smaller, to apologize for existing in a way that inconvenienced someone else's idea of what I should be. I didn't do it. Vivian's hand found mine before I could decide what to say, her fingers lacing through my remaining hand steady and sure. "She's not someone else's kid," Vivian said, her voice level and cold in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "She's the reason I remembered what actually matters, which is more than you've ever managed with every advantage you were handed for free. And Daniel isn't missing anything, Preston. He's the most whole person I've ever met. You should try it sometime. Might improve your balance sheet." She didn't wait for his response. She just turned and walked us both toward the elevator, her hand still in mine, and I understood in that moment that whatever she'd hidden for 8 months, whatever it had cost me to find out sideways from a headline on my lunch break, none of it changed what was standing in front of me now. A woman who'd been handed every reason in the world to stay comfortable and quiet, and had chosen instead to stand in a glass room full of people who underestimated her and fight for 60 strangers she'd only known for 8 months, because one of them mattered enough to make the rest matter too. We didn't fix everything in the elevator. Trust doesn't work that fast, and I won't pretend it did. But that night, sitting on my back steps again, this time with Vivian beside me instead of alone, I told her the truth I'd been circling since the parking lot. "I was more scared of losing you than I was of finding out who you really are," I said. "I think that's why I stayed away those 11 days. Not because I didn't want to forgive you. Because I already knew I would, and that terrified me more than the anger did." She leaned her head against my shoulder, the one that still had an arm attached to it. "I'm sorry it took a corporate crisis for me to prove I meant what I said in that parking lot." "You didn't need the board meeting to prove it," I said. "You just needed to stop being scared of your own name." Everything else followed. The 90-day review came back clean, and clearer than clean. Not one position from our warehouse floor ended up on the final cut list. Preston's sale never went through in its original form. The private equity firm walked when the review made the actual cost of efficiency too public for their comfort. Russ, of all people, ended up thanking Vivian directly, gruffly, like the words cost him something physical to say, and I noticed after that he stopped writing the floor quite so hard about quotas when someone's kid was sick. Lily found out who Vivian really was about a month later, the way kids find out anything complicated, in pieces, and she processed it with the simple clarity only a 7-year-old can manage. "So you're rich," she said to Vivian over dinner one night, not a question so much as a fact she was trying on for size. "I am," Vivian said. "Are you still gonna know about dinosaurs?" "Ankylosaurus," Vivian said solemnly. "Still underrated." Lily nodded, satisfied, and went back to her macaroni, and that was apparently the entire extent of what mattered to a 7-year-old about the woman her father loved having enough money to buy the building she went to daycare pickup at. I've thought about that moment more than almost any other in this whole story, because it reminded me that the people who love you best were never impressed by the money in the first place. They were impressed that you crouched down to their height and knew which dinosaur had the tail club. We got married 18 months later, in my backyard, not a ballroom, because Vivian said she'd spent 31 years standing in rooms designed to impress people and she was done with all of it. She wore a simple dress, no designer name attached to it that either of us ever bothered to find out. Lily was the flower girl and took the job so seriously she refused to let anyone else touch the basket of petals for the entire reception. Preston didn't come. We didn't expect him to. Vivian's mother did, though, quiet and a little stiff at first, watching her daughter marry a man with one arm and a factory job like she was still working out whether to be proud or embarrassed. By the end of the night, after watching Lily drag her onto the makeshift dance floor to teach her some dance move from a cartoon, I noticed the stiffness had softened into something closer to relief. I think some part of her had been waiting a long time to see Vivian happy in a way that had nothing to do with a balance sheet. I still work at Halden. Vivian does too, though everyone on the floor knows now exactly who she is, and somehow it changed less than either of us expected. She still eats lunch at the same table. She still asks good questions. She just doesn't have to hide the answers to her own anymore. Sometimes at night, after Lily's asleep and the house has gone quiet, Vivian and I sit on those same back steps where this whole thing really started to turn, and I think about how close I came to walking away over those 11 days. How easy it would have been to let the lie be the whole story instead of just one hard chapter in a longer one. I think about Sarah sometimes too, in those quiet moments, not with the sharp grief I used to carry, but with something softer, gratitude maybe, that the life I get to keep living includes room for both of them. The woman who gave me Lily, and the woman who taught me that needing help was never the same thing as failing. People still ask me sometimes how we ended up together, a warehouse worker with one arm and a woman who could buy the whole warehouse without checking her bank balance first. I tell them the truth. She found out I was raising my daughter alone with one arm, and instead of treating me like something fragile or something to fix, she just handed me the diaper bag and let me carry it the way I always had, on my own terms, at my own pace. She never told anyone she was a billionaire. She let me find out the hard way. And somehow, impossibly, we built something honest out of the wreckage of that lie anyway. What would you have done if you found out the quiet coworker who never judged you was hiding something that big? Would you have walked away, or would you have stayed to hear the whole story first? And have you ever had someone see past everything you thought made you less than whole? Tell me in the comments. If this one hit you somewhere, leave a like, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.